At exactly 3:12 a.m., nurse Emily Carter answered a phone call that lasted only 47 seconds. 3 days later, prosecutors would insist those 47 seconds never happened. They called her a murderer. The hospital fired her before sunrise. The news called her the angel of death. But buried inside an old hospital phone server was one forgotten recording that would destroy the entire case and expose a truth no one expected. For 12 years, Emily Carter had been the kind of intensive care nurse every family hoped would be standing beside their loved one. She never rushed through a patient's room. She remembered birthdays, comforted frightened relatives during the longest nights, and stayed beyond the end of her shift when someone needed a reassuring voice. At St. Anne's Medical Center in Ohio, co-workers often joked that Emily knew the hospital better than the architects who designed it. She wasn't famous, wealthy, or extraordinary in the public eye. She was simply trusted. And in a hospital, trust is one of the most valuable things a person can earn. On the evening of October 14th, Emily began another overnight shift in the intensive care unit. The rain outside tapped softly against the windows as ambulances came and went beneath the glowing emergency entrance. Inside the ICU, monitors beeped steadily, nurses exchanged patient updates, and fluorescent lights illuminated long, quiet hallways where every decision carried life or death consequences. For Emily, it felt like hundreds of other nights she had already worked. One of her assigned patients was Michael Donovan, a 58-year-old high school history teacher recovering from routine heart surgery. His operation had gone well, and doctors expected him to be transferred out of intensive care within 48 hours. Before midnight, Michael even joked with Emily about missing his students and promised he would return to the classroom before Thanksgiving. Nothing about his condition suggested that the next few hours would become the center of a national murder investigation. Shortly after 3 a.m., the atmosphere inside the ICU changed. A trauma patient arrived unexpectedly, drawing several nurses into an emergency response. Doctors rushed toward the operating suite while alarms echoed briefly through the hallway. Emily helped stabilize another patient before returning to check on Michael. His vital signs remained stable. She adjusted in 4-line, documented her observations in the electronic chart, and quietly reminded him to rest. Everything appeared routine. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the nurse's station phone rang. Emily answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When she hung up, she quickly walked toward another room after receiving new instructions from the hospital supervisor. At the time, no one thought the phone call mattered. No one wrote about it in a report. No one imagined it would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Less than 20 minutes later, Michael Donovan's heart monitor suddenly erupted into a continuous alarm. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room. Emergency resuscitation began instantly. Chest compressions, defibrillation, emergency medication. Every second mattered. For nearly 25 minutes, the medical team fought to save him. But despite every effort, Michael Donovan was pronounced dead at 3:41 a.m. Silence settled over the ICU. Emily stood near the doorway, breathing heavily, unable to understand how a patient who had seemed stable only minutes earlier had deteriorated so quickly. Around her, exhausted doctors quietly completed paperwork while hospital administrators were notified of the unexpected death. It was heartbreaking, but in critical care medicine, tragic outcomes sometimes occurred despite everyone's best efforts. By sunrise, rumors had already begun. A pharmacist noticed an inconsistency in the medication records. An administrator reported it to hospital leadership. Leadership contacted the police, and before the end of the day, detectives arrived at St. Anne's Medical Center carrying search warrants. Emily believed they wanted to understand what had happened. She had no idea. They had already decided who they believed was responsible. By noon, every hallway inside St. Anne's Medical Center felt different. Doctors spoke in whispers. Nurses avoided eye contact. Hospital administrators locked themselves inside conference rooms. The death of Michael Donovan was no longer being treated as an unexpected medical tragedy. Someone had quietly used a word that changed everything. Homicide. For Emily Carter, the change was impossible to ignore. Only a few hours earlier, she had been comforting grieving family members. Now security officers escorted her to a small interview room on the hospital's administrative floor. She wasn't under arrest. At least, that was what they told her. Two detectives introduced themselves politely before placing a thick folder onto the table. Inside were medication charts, electronic access logs, and surveillance photographs from the ICU corridor. Detective Daniel Brooks leaned forward. "Nurse Carter, we only want the truth." Emily nodded. "So do I." The detective slid a printed document across the table. Hospital records show someone administered a fatal dose of potassium chloride to Mr. Donovan at approximately 3:18 a.m. Emily looked confused. "That's impossible. I never gave him potassium." Brooks didn't respond. Instead, he placed another sheet on the table. "This medication order was accessed using your login credentials." Emily stared at the screen capture. It displayed her employee identification number, her password, the exact workstation assigned to the ICU nurse's station. For a brief moment, even she questioned what she was seeing. There has to be some mistake. "I didn't enter this." The second detective finally spoke. "Computers don't usually make mistakes." Emily answered quietly. "People do." Across the hospital, the news spread faster than anyone expected. Employees whispered in elevators. Staff members checked social media. Someone leaked information to a local television station. By early evening, breaking news banners filled television screens across Ohio. ICU nurse under investigation for suspected patient murder. Within hours, national media picked up the story. Comment sections exploded. Thousands of strangers who had never met Emily Carter suddenly believed they already knew exactly who she was. Some called her a monster. Others demanded life imprisonment. No trial had begun. No evidence had been tested in court. But public opinion had already reached its verdict. Late that night, Emily returned home. She barely had time to remove her shoes before another phone call arrived. It wasn't family. It wasn't a friend. It was the hospital's human resources department. The voice on the other end sounded rehearsed. "Effective immediately. Your employment has been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation." Emily closed her eyes. 12 years of service ended in less than 30 seconds. The following morning, police executed a search warrant at her home. Neighbors watched silently through their windows. News helicopters circled overhead. Television cameras captured every moment as detectives carried away computers, medical textbooks, and handwritten notebooks. Emily's photograph appeared on nearly every major news website before sunset. One headline read, "Angel of Death?" Another called her, "The Killer Nurse Next Door." Each headline reached millions of readers. None mentioned one important fact. There was still no physical evidence proving Emily had poisoned anyone. Only electronic records. Electronic records that everyone assumed were impossible to manipulate. 3 days later, the county prosecutor held a nationally televised press conference. Standing behind a row of microphones, he spoke with complete confidence. "Our investigation has uncovered compelling digital evidence showing that nurse Emily Carter intentionally administered a lethal medication to the victim. We believe this was a deliberate act. We are seeking first-degree murder charges." Flashes from dozens of cameras illuminated the room. For the public, the story seemed finished. But hundreds of miles away, a quiet attorney named Rebecca Lawson watched the press conference from her office. Something about the prosecutor's timeline bothered her. Not emotionally, logically. She replayed the presentation several times. Every timestamp matched perfectly. Too perfectly. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, then whispered 4 words to herself. Something isn't being shown. She didn't know what was missing. She only knew one thing. In 12 years of defending wrongful conviction cases, whenever evidence looked absolutely perfect, it usually wasn't. Rebecca Lawson didn't begin by reviewing the autopsy report. She didn't ask for toxicology results. She didn't even request the surveillance footage that investigators claimed proved Emily Carter had entered Michael Donovan's room moments before his death. Instead, she asked the hospital for something so ordinary that everyone assumed it couldn't possibly matter. Every internal phone record from the ICU between 2:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. The hospital's legal department looked puzzled. The phone records? Rebecca nodded. Every extension, every transfer, every incoming call. Nothing deleted, nothing edited. The hospital administrator shrugged. If that's what you want. 3 days later, a technician delivered a hard drive containing thousands of internal call logs from the hospital's aging communication server. Most attorneys would have ignored them. Rebecca didn't. For nearly 8 hours, she examined every timestamp. Most calls lasted only a few seconds. Doctors calling laboratories, nurses requesting medication, emergency transfers, routine conversations. Everything looked exactly as expected. until she reached one line. 3:12 and 18 seconds a.m. Incoming call. Duration, 047. Extension, ICU nurses station answered by Emily Carter. Rebecca immediately compared the call with the prosecution's timeline. According to investigators, Emily was supposedly inside Michael Donovan's room preparing a fatal injection at that exact moment. But the phone system showed something very different. Emily had been standing at the nurse's station, speaking on the telephone. 47 uninterrupted seconds. It wasn't enough to prove her innocence, but it was enough to prove the prosecution's timeline could not be accurate. Rebecca requested the actual recording. The hospital's IT director hesitated. "I'm not sure it still exists. These systems automatically overwrite audio after 90 days. Rebecca looked at him. "Has anyone checked?" The director quietly admitted, "No." Within hours, technicians began searching backup servers stored beneath the hospital's administrative building. Dust-covered archive drives, forgotten storage cabinets, outdated magnetic backup tapes. Most were unreadable. Several had been damaged years earlier. Finally, late that evening, a technician walked into the server room carrying an old backup cartridge. "I think we found something." The recording was restored overnight. The audio wasn't perfect. Static filled the background, but the voices were unmistakable. Rebecca pressed play. A tired voice answered. "ICU. Emily Carter speaking." The caller responded immediately. "This is Dr. Raymond Ellis from Surgical Recovery. I need you to come to room 214 immediately." Emily answered without hesitation. "I'm on my way." The conversation ended. 47 seconds. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious. Just a routine hospital call. Except for one detail. Room 214 wasn't Michael Donovan's room. It was located on the opposite side of the intensive care unit. Hospital security cameras confirmed Emily arrived there less than a minute later. She remained inside assisting another patient for nearly 6 minutes. Rebecca slowly looked back at the prosecution's timeline. According to detectives, Emily had supposedly administered a fatal medication to Michael Donovan during those exact same 6 minutes. She quietly whispered to herself. She couldn't have been in two places at once. The following morning, Rebecca requested every security camera covering the ICU corridor. Hospital administrators exchanged uncomfortable looks. One finally spoke. "Those recordings were deleted." Rebecca frowned. "Deleted?" "They were automatically erased." "When?" The administrator swallowed hard. 2 days. After detectives seized the medication records. Rebecca stared at him. "Who authorized that?" No one answered. For the first time since the investigation began, Rebecca believed she wasn't looking at an ordinary mistake. She might be looking at evidence that had disappeared before anyone realized how important it would become. She immediately filed an emergency motion asking the court to preserve every remaining digital record connected to the hospital. Computer servers, medication databases, access logs, telephone systems, backup archives. If someone had already erased one piece of evidence, there was no guarantee they wouldn't erase more. Meanwhile, Emily sat alone inside the county jail. The news continued describing her as the killer nurse. Former co-workers refused interviews. Friends stopped answering their phones. Letters filled with hate arrived every day. She wondered whether anyone outside those concrete walls still believed she was innocent. Then a correctional officer quietly approached her cell. "You have a visitor." Emily looked surprised. "Who is it?" The officer smiled faintly. "Your lawyer." Emily entered the visitation room, expecting another difficult conversation. Instead, Rebecca placed a pair of headphones on the table. "Before we discuss anything, I want you to listen." Emily pressed the play button. 47 seconds later, tears filled her eyes. She looked at Rebecca. I told them I answered that phone." Rebecca nodded. "I know. And now, we can prove it." For the first time since her arrest, Emily allowed herself to believe something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Rebecca Lawson left the county jail with one thought repeating in her mind. The 47-second phone call had proven that Emily Carter could not have been standing beside Michael Donovan's bed at the exact moment the prosecution claimed she administered the fatal medication. But proving where Emily wasn't still didn't answer the question that now mattered most. Who was inside room 312 instead? Somewhere inside St. Anne's Medical Center, another person had walked through those hospital doors that night. And if Rebecca could identify them, the entire prosecution's theory might begin to collapse. The next morning, she filed an emergency motion requesting every electronic security badge record from the intensive care unit. Modern hospitals tracked every employee movement. Every doctor, nurse, pharmacist, technician, and maintenance worker carried an identification badge that automatically unlocked secure doors. Each time a badge touched a scanner, the hospital's computer quietly recorded the employee's name, the location, and the exact second the door opened. Investigators had already collected medication logs and computer records, but surprisingly, no one had examined the building's access control system. Hospital administrators reluctantly agreed to provide the records. Within 24 hours, Rebecca received thousands of electronic entries covering every door surrounding the ICU. Most of them were routine. Nurses entered medication rooms. Doctors moved between patient wings. Cleaning staff completed overnight rounds. Every entry reflected the normal rhythm of a busy hospital. Then one timestamp immediately caught Rebecca's attention. At 3:16 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after Emily answered the phone call, and while security cameras showed her walking toward room 214, someone else's badge unlocked the secure entrance leading directly into Michael Donovan's treatment area. The badge belonged to Thomas Reed, the hospital's overnight pharmacy supervisor. Rebecca immediately reviewed Thomas Reed's original police interview. According to detectives, Reed had stated that he never entered the intensive care unit during the entire overnight shift. He claimed he remained inside the pharmacy preparing medication requests until sunrise. His statement had never been questioned because investigators believed Emily Carter had already been identified as the only possible suspect. Rebecca slowly placed the badge records beside Reed's signed statement. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. One document showed he never entered the ICU. The hospital's own electronic system showed his badge unlocking the ICU door at precisely 3:16 a.m. Only one of those records could be true. Rebecca wasn't ready to accuse anyone. She had spent too many years defending innocent people to make assumptions before understanding every fact. Instead, she requested additional records, security camera footage from the pharmacy entrance, inventory reports for controlled medications, and overnight staffing schedules. If Thomas Reed had entered the ICU for a legitimate reason, the paperwork would explain it. It didn't. The pharmacy inventory showed no medication delivery scheduled for Michael Donovan's room that morning. The nursing logs contained no request for emergency pharmaceutical assistance. Even more surprising, Reed's own activity report indicated he had electronically signed out of the pharmacy computer several minutes before his badge appeared inside the intensive care unit. There was simply no documented reason for him to be there. That afternoon, Rebecca arranged to meet the hospital's senior information technology specialist, a quiet engineer named Kevin Morales who had maintained the hospital's electronic systems for nearly 15 years. Unlike administrators concerned about public image, Kevin cared only about whether the data accurately reflected reality. Rebecca placed the badge records on the table. Can these timestamps be wrong? Kevin adjusted his glasses before carefully reviewing the reports. After several minutes, he slowly shook his head. Not these. Why are you so certain? Because the access control system uses an independent time server. He pointed toward one of the reports. Even if someone changes the clock on a hospital computer, these door records don't change. Every badge scan is synchronized automatically. Rebecca remained silent. Kevin continued. If this report says Thomas Reed entered the ICU at 3:16 a.m. then that's exactly when the door opened. For the first time since accepting Emily's case, Rebecca felt the investigation shift in a completely different direction. The prosecution had spent months proving Emily Carter had access to the patient, but they had never asked who else had access. And now, one forgotten electronic badge suggested another person had been standing only a few feet away from Michael Donovan during the most critical minutes of the night. Rebecca carefully gathered the documents into her briefcase. As she reached the parking lot, her phone vibrated. It was Kevin. His voice sounded noticeably different. You need to come back. Right now. Rebecca turned around immediately. What happened? Kevin spoke quietly. I searched the server history. There were originally 2 badge entries at 3:16 a.m. Rebecca stopped walking. 2? Yes. But someone deleted the second one. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. If someone had intentionally removed an electronic access record from the hospital's security system, This case was no longer just about a suspicious patient death. It had become a case involving missing digital evidence. And somewhere inside St. Anne's Medical Center, someone was still trying to hide the truth. Rebecca Lawson barely slept that night. Every new piece of evidence answered one question, but immediately created another. Emily Carter's forgotten phone call had already dismantled the prosecution's timeline. The security badge records had revealed that someone else entered the intensive care unit while Emily was responding to another emergency. Now there was only one question that truly mattered. Who had deleted the second badge entry and why? Rebecca knew that somewhere inside the hospital's digital archives, the answer still existed. Someone had tried to erase the truth, but in her experience, computers often remembered what people desperately wanted them to forget. Early the next morning, Rebecca returned to St. Anne's Medical Center before sunrise. The corridors were unusually quiet, and the server room beneath the administration building felt isolated from the rest of the hospital. Kevin Morales, the senior IT engineer, had spent the entire night searching through archived backups that hadn't been accessed in years. Old storage drives, forgotten server images, and automatic system backups covered the table beside him. He looked exhausted, but there was something different in his expression. It wasn't frustration anymore. It was disbelief. Without saying a word, Kevin turned his monitor toward Rebecca. On the screen were two versions of the same electronic access log. The first was the record detectives had received during their investigation. It showed only one badge entering the ICU at 3:16 a.m. The second record came from an automatic backup created 6 hours before police collected the hospital's servers. This version contained an additional entry, one that no longer existed in the official files. Rebecca stared silently at the screen. The missing badge belonged to Dr. Andrew Keller, the hospital's assistant medical director. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Dr. Keller wasn't an ordinary physician. He supervised emergency response procedures, approved medication protocols, and regularly advised hospital administrators during legal investigations. During Emily's police interview, Keller had personally assured detectives that Emily was the only staff member with both the opportunity and access to administer the fatal medication. His statement had become one of the strongest foundations of the prosecution's case. Rebecca slowly leaned closer to the monitor. The backup server showed something else. Dr. Keller's badge entered the ICU at 3:17 a.m. It exited only 4 minutes later. Those 4 minutes overlapped almost perfectly with the period prosecutors claimed Emily Carter committed murder. Rebecca immediately requested Keller's original witness statement. She read every page carefully, searching for any mention of entering the ICU that night. There was none. According to his signed testimony, he remained inside an administrative meeting until after 4 o'clock in the morning. If the backup server was accurate, and Kevin insisted it was, then Dr. Keller had lied under oath long before the trial had even begun. Rebecca refused to jump to conclusions. A false statement didn't automatically make someone guilty. People sometimes misremember stressful nights, especially inside busy hospitals. But deleting a security log was something entirely different. That required intention. Someone had consciously removed evidence that placed Dr. Keller near the victim during the most critical moments of the investigation. Kevin opened another folder. I found something else. He displayed the system administrator history for the hospital's security software. Every modification made to electronic badge records required administrator-level authorization. The log identified the exact computer used, the exact time the deletion occurred, and the account responsible for the change. Rebecca expected to see the name of an IT employee. Instead, the administrator account had been accessed using temporary credentials issued directly from the hospital executive office. Only 3 people had permission to authorize those credentials. Dr. Andrew Keller was one of them. The room fell silent. Rebecca felt the investigation shifting beneath her feet. This was no longer just about a wrongful accusation. It was becoming a story about missing digital evidence, false statements, and someone with enough authority to quietly influence an entire investigation before it ever reached a courtroom. She closed her notebook and looked at Kevin. Has anyone else seen these backup files? Kevin shook his head. Only you. Rebecca answered calmly but firmly. From this moment forward, no one copies them. No one deletes anything. And no one tells the hospital administration what we've found. Kevin nodded. I already made 3 encrypted backups. Rebecca smiled faintly. For the first time in weeks, I think we're finally protecting the truth instead of chasing it. As she walked toward the elevator, her phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID displayed a private number. Rebecca answered. A calm, unfamiliar voice spoke only one sentence. "If you care about your client, stop looking at the hospital servers." The line disconnected before she could respond. Rebecca remained completely still. She had defended innocent people for more than a decade. She had received angry letters. She had been criticized by prosecutors. But this was the first time someone had tried to frighten her away from the evidence. Instead of feeling afraid, she became certain she was moving in the right direction. Because innocent investigations rarely generate anonymous threats. Someone, somewhere inside St. Anne's Medical Center, had realized the truth was beginning to surface. And they were running out of time. Rebecca Lawson spent the rest of the afternoon studying every document she had collected over the past 2 weeks. Spread across her office table were hospital access logs, medication records, electronic badge reports, witness statements, and copies of the hospital's internal communication logs. Individually, each document seemed ordinary. Together, they painted a picture that no longer matched the prosecution's version of events. Someone had entered the ICU without explanation. Someone had removed electronic records from the security system. Someone had given investigators a timeline that no longer made sense. Rebecca wasn't simply defending Emily Carter anymore. She was beginning to uncover evidence suggesting the investigation itself had gone terribly wrong. Late that evening, Kevin Morales called again. His voice carried a mixture of excitement and disbelief. While searching through archived network files, he had discovered something completely unexpected. Years earlier, the hospital had installed temporary construction cameras during an ICU renovation project. The cameras were never intended for patient monitoring. They existed only to document contractor activity and equipment deliveries while part of the intensive care unit was being remodeled. Once construction ended, administrators believed the system had been disconnected. Everyone assumed the cameras had stopped recording years ago, but they hadn't. One forgotten camera remained connected to an isolated backup server that no one had checked during the investigation. The recordings weren't stored with the hospital's primary surveillance system. They were automatically archived on an old maintenance server located in the building's engineering department. Because investigators never knew the camera existed, they never requested its footage. For nearly 8 months, the video had remained untouched. Rebecca immediately drove back to the hospital. Inside the engineering office, Kevin carefully restored the recording from the night Michael Donovan died. The video quality wasn't perfect. The image was grainy, and the hallway appeared darker than expected. But the timestamp remained clear. 3:14 a.m. The hallway outside the ICU appeared almost empty. A nurse pushed an equipment cart toward another patient room. A physician walked past carrying medical charts. Everything looked routine. Then, at 3:16 a.m., a familiar figure entered the frame. Dr. Andrew Keller. Rebecca leaned closer to the monitor. According to his sworn testimony, he had never entered the ICU that night. Yet the video clearly showed him walking through the secured entrance, looking over his shoulder before disappearing into the restricted patient corridor. There was no uncertainty about his identity. His white physician's coat displayed the hospital logo, and his identification badge reflected briefly under the hallway lights. Kevin paused the recording. This timestamp matches the deleted badge record exactly. Rebecca nodded silently. Keep playing. The video continued. Nearly 5 minutes later, Dr. Keller emerged from the same corridor. But something immediately caught Rebecca's attention. When he entered the hallway, his hands had been empty. When he exited, he was carrying a small gray medical container. Kevin zoomed in as much as the old recording allowed. A faded hospital pharmacy label was barely visible on one side. Neither of them spoke. Rebecca wasn't interested in assumptions. She wanted facts. So she compared the timestamp with the pharmacy inventory reports she had reviewed the previous day. The numbers didn't match. According to official records, no medication container had been issued from the pharmacy during that time. Yet the video clearly showed Dr. Keller leaving the ICU with one in his hand. Rebecca slowly closed the folder containing the prosecution's timeline. Every major piece of evidence they had presented depended on one central claim: that Emily Carter had been the only person with both access and opportunity. Now the forgotten construction camera had destroyed that claim. Another person had entered the restricted area. Another person had left carrying medical equipment. And that person's presence had never been disclosed to investigators. As midnight approached, Rebecca prepared an emergency motion requesting that the court immediately preserve the construction camera footage before anyone had an opportunity to question its authenticity or remove it from the server. She also requested an independent digital forensic examination so that experts, not lawyers or police officers, could verify the recording had never been altered. Before leaving the engineering office, Kevin quietly looked at Rebecca. "If this video is real," Rebecca finished the sentence. "Then someone built an entire murder case while ignoring the one camera that could challenge it." Kevin nodded. "And someone knew this camera existed." Rebecca looked once more at the frozen image of Dr. Keller standing in the ICU hallway. She no longer believed the investigation had simply overlooked important evidence. She believed important evidence had been left behind because no one thought anyone would ever find it. As she stepped outside into the cold night air, her phone vibrated with a message from the prosecutor's office. The trial date had officially been moved forward. Rebecca smiled for the first time in weeks. They believed their case was becoming stronger. They had no idea that, hidden inside an obsolete maintenance server, a forgotten camera had already begun dismantling the foundation of everything they planned to present to the jury. The construction camera had changed the direction of the entire case, but Rebecca Lawson knew that a single video would never be enough to convince a jury. The prosecution could argue that Dr. Andrew Keller had entered the ICU for a perfectly legitimate reason. They could claim he was checking on another patient or responding to an emergency elsewhere on the floor. Rebecca needed evidence that explained not only where he had been, but what he had done after he entered the restricted unit. That answer, she believed, had to be hidden inside the hospital's electronic medical records. Unlike paper charts, every modern hospital record leaves a digital footprint. Every time a doctor opens a patient's file, changes a medication order, edits a diagnosis, or updates a treatment note, the system quietly records the user's identity, the exact time of the change, and even the computer terminal used to make it. Most people never see these background records because they exist only for system administrators and forensic investigators. But Rebecca knew they could reveal whether the official patient file had always looked the way prosecutors claimed. With a court order in hand, she hired an independent digital forensics specialist named Daniel Hughes, a former cybersecurity investigator who specialized in recovering deleted hospital data. Daniel didn't begin by reading the visible medical notes. Instead, he examined the invisible audit trail buried beneath them. For nearly 2 days, he reconstructed thousands of electronic transactions from backup servers, comparing every saved version of Michael Donovan's medical file with the version presented to police. What he found stunned everyone in the room. The medication chart prosecutors had relied on was not the original record. According to the audit log, Michael Donovan's file had been modified at 5:48 a.m., more than 2 hours after his death and nearly an hour before detectives first arrived at the hospital. The system showed that several medication timestamps had been adjusted, a treatment note had been rewritten, and one administration record had been added after the fact. None of those changes appeared in the printed documents investigators later received. Rebecca asked the question that immediately came to her mind. "Can you identify who made the edits?" Daniel slowly turned his laptop toward her. The audit trail listed a single user account, Dr. Andrew Keller. The room fell silent. Rebecca looked at the screen again, making sure she hadn't misunderstood. The electronic record didn't merely show that Keller had opened the patient's chart. It showed that he had edited critical information after Michael Donovan had already been pronounced dead. More importantly, those edits helped create the exact timeline later presented by prosecutors to accuse Emily Carter. Daniel remained careful with his conclusions. "I can't tell you why these changes were made," he said. "Hospitals occasionally correct documentation after emergencies. That alone isn't proof of wrongdoing." Rebecca nodded. "I understand. But can you tell whether these entries were added after the patient's death?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes. The system timestamps are cryptographically synchronized. These edits occurred after the code was over and after the official time of death." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, trying to absorb the significance of what she had just learned. Until now, every discovery had raised questions about the investigation. This was different. For the first time, there was objective digital evidence showing that one of the prosecution's most important witnesses had altered the very medical record at the center of the case. Still, Rebecca refused to rush to conclusions. Editing a medical chart after a patient's death might have an innocent explanation. Doctors sometimes corrected incomplete documentation or added information that had been missed during a chaotic emergency. She knew that if she overstated the evidence, the defense could lose credibility with the jury. What mattered wasn't speculation. It was whether Dr. Keller could provide a consistent, truthful explanation for the changes. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During a pretrial hearing, Keller testified that every note in Michael Donovan's medical record had been entered in real time during the emergency response. Rebecca quietly opened the forensic report and compared it with his sworn statement. The timestamps didn't agree. When the judge allowed cross-examination, Rebecca asked a single question. "Dr. Keller, are you telling this court that none of the entries in Mr. Donovan's chart were created after his death?" Keller answered confidently, "That's correct." Rebecca placed the forensic audit on the evidence screen. "Then can you explain why the hospital's own system shows your account modifying the medication timeline at 5:48 a.m., more than 2 hours after the patient was pronounced dead?" For the first time since taking the witness stand, Dr. Keller didn't answer immediately. The silence inside the courtroom lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. And in that silence, the prosecution's carefully constructed timeline began to crack. The courtroom had never been quieter. Dr. Andrew Keller stepped down from the witness stand looking far less confident than he had only an hour earlier. Rebecca Lawson didn't celebrate the moment. She had spent enough years defending wrongful conviction cases to know that exposing contradictions was only half the battle. Jurors rarely changed their minds because a witness appeared uncomfortable. They changed their minds when someone with nothing to gain finally decided to tell the truth. That person appeared 2 days later. Just after sunrise, Rebecca's office phone rang. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling. The caller refused to give a name at first. They simply asked one question. "Are you really trying to prove Emily Carter is innocent?" Rebecca answered honestly, "I'm trying to prove what actually happened." There was a long silence before the caller quietly replied, "Then I think I have something you need." Less than an hour later, a woman walked into Rebecca's office wearing plain clothes, sunglasses, and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She introduced herself as Sarah Whitmore, a senior ICU nurse who had worked alongside Emily Carter for nearly 6 years. Rebecca immediately recognized the name. Sarah had been listed as a potential witness during the investigation, but prosecutors had never called her to testify, and detectives had interviewed her for less than 15 minutes. Sarah sat down slowly, her hands visibly shaking. She admitted she had almost convinced herself to stay silent forever. She feared losing her job, destroying her career, and becoming the next target of public suspicion. But after watching the trial unfold, she could no longer ignore what she had seen on the night Michael Donovan died. Rebecca listened without interrupting. Sarah explained that the ICU had been unusually chaotic after the emergency trauma patient arrived shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning. Nurses rushed between rooms while physicians coordinated multiple treatments at once. During those hectic minutes, Sarah remembered seeing Dr. Andrew Keller walking quickly toward Michael Donovan's room, carrying a gray medication container. She assumed he had been responding to an urgent request from another physician. At the time, nothing about the scene appeared unusual. Senior doctors often entered patient rooms without explaining every decision to the nursing staff. But what happened next stayed with her. Several minutes later, Keller left the room looking noticeably different. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't giving instructions. He simply placed the container inside a medical disposal cabinet before walking directly toward the administrative hallway. When Sarah later asked another nurse whether Dr. Keller had ordered additional medication for Michael Donovan, the nurse looked confused. According to the medication chart, no physician had requested any emergency changes. Sarah remembered thinking it was strange. Then Michael Donovan suffered cardiac arrest. Everything that followed happened so quickly that she never connected those moments until months later. Rebecca carefully asked, "Did you tell detectives any of this?" Sarah lowered her eyes. "I tried." She explained that during her police interview, she briefly mentioned seeing Dr. Keller enter the ICU. The detective stopped writing, looked at her, and replied that electronic records already showed Emily Carter had administered the medication. He suggested Sarah must have been mistaken about the timing because the computer evidence was already clear. Feeling uncertain and intimidated, Sarah assumed she had confused one doctor with another during a stressful shift. She never insisted they investigate further. For months, she carried that doubt with her. Then she watched Rebecca expose the deleted badge record. She saw the forgotten phone call. She heard about the construction camera. Piece by piece, the evidence matched the memory she had tried so hard to convince herself was wrong. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. I kept asking myself the same question every night. What if Emily is in jail because I stayed quiet? Rebecca gently placed a glass of water in front of her. You came here. That's what matters now. Sarah reached into her bag and removed a small notebook. It wasn't an official hospital record. It was her personal shift journal, something she had kept for years to help remember unusual nights and difficult cases. On the page dated October 14th, beside a list of patient observations, she had written a short note during the shift. 3:17 a.m., Dr. Keller entered room 312 with pharmacy container. No medication request noted. The handwriting wasn't dramatic. The sentence wasn't intended for court. It had been written before anyone knew a crime was even suspected. That made it potentially important. Rebecca knew the notebook alone would not determine the outcome of the trial. Memories can fade, and personal notes are not the same as official records. But combined with the phone log, the badge data, the construction camera footage, and the medical audit trail, Sarah's testimony added another piece to a growing pattern that the jury could evaluate. As Sarah prepared to leave, she stopped at the office door. I don't know what really happened to Michael Donovan. Rebecca nodded. Neither do I. I only know one thing. Sarah looked back. Emily Carter didn't deserve to become the answer before anyone asked the right questions. Rebecca watched the door close behind her. For the first time since taking the case, she realized the defense was no longer built on isolated facts. It was becoming a complete story. A story that challenged the prosecution's timeline, questioned critical evidence, and gave the jury a reason to pause before accepting the original accusation. The courtroom was packed long before the morning session began. Reporters lined the back wall with notebooks already open. Television cameras waited outside the courthouse, and every seat in the public gallery had been filled before sunrise. For weeks, the prosecution had presented the case as a straightforward story of betrayal inside a hospital. They believed the digital evidence spoke for itself. But as Rebecca Lawson arranged her files across the defense table, she knew the jury was about to see something very different. They weren't about to hear another opinion. They were about to watch the hospital's own computer systems tell the story, second by second. To ensure complete neutrality, the judge had appointed an independent digital forensics team from the state laboratory. Their assignment wasn't to decide who was guilty or innocent. Their job was far simpler and far more important. Using untouched server backups, security logs, phone records, and electronic medical data, they reconstructed every verified event that occurred inside St. Anne's Medical Center between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock on the morning Michael Donovan died. Every timestamp had been verified against multiple systems. Every digital record had been cross-checked. Nothing in the reconstruction depended on memory or personal opinion. When the lead forensic analyst took the witness stand, he carefully explained the process to the jury. Hospital phone systems, electronic badge readers, medical software, and server backups all operated independently from one another. Because each system generated its own timestamps, investigators could compare them to determine whether the overall timeline remained consistent. If one system conflicted with another, the inconsistency became immediately visible. The analyst emphasized that their reconstruction did not accuse anyone of a crime. It simply showed where the available evidence placed each person during the critical minutes. The courtroom lights dimmed as the reconstruction appeared on the large evidence screen. A digital timeline stretched across the display, beginning at 3 a.m. and advancing minute by minute. At 3:12 a.m., the system confirmed Emily Carter answered the ICU telephone for 47 seconds. Simultaneously, hospital communication logs showed another physician requesting her assistance in room 214. Seconds later, construction camera footage showed Emily walking away from Michael Donovan's corridor. At 3:16 a.m., the security badge system recorded Dr. Andrew Keller entering the restricted ICU area. 4 minutes later, the same system recorded his departure. Throughout that entire period, there was no verified evidence placing Emily Carter inside Michael Donovan's room. The analyst paused the presentation before moving to the next section. He explained that the prosecution's original timeline required Emily to administer the fatal medication while she was simultaneously answering the hospital phone and responding to another patient's emergency. Based on the synchronized records, that sequence of events was not physically possible. The independent reconstruction didn't establish who caused Michael Donovan's death, but it demonstrated that the prosecution's theory could not be reconciled with the hospital's own electronic systems. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Several jurors leaned forward, studying the screen more closely. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecution's version of events appeared incomplete. Rebecca remained silent. She understood that juries often paid closer attention to calm evidence than dramatic speeches. The analyst continued. He displayed the audit history of Michael Donovan's medical record, showing that important entries had been modified after the patient's death. The jury also saw the deleted badge record recovered from the backup server and the construction camera footage that investigators had never reviewed during the original investigation. Each piece of evidence supported the others. None of them, standing alone, proved exactly what had happened. Together, however, they raised serious questions about whether the investigation had overlooked or misunderstood critical facts. When the prosecutor began cross-examination, he attempted to challenge the reconstruction by suggesting that hospital clocks occasionally drifted out of sync. The forensic analyst calmly explained that every system involved in the reconstruction synchronized automatically with the same secure network time source. Minor differences measured in fractions of a second were possible, but not the several-minute discrepancy required to support the prosecution's timeline. The prosecutor tried another approach. "So you're telling this jury that Dr. Keller committed the crime?" The analyst immediately shook his head. "No, my testimony doesn't identify a perpetrator. It only demonstrates that the timeline presented during the investigation is inconsistent with the verified digital evidence." The distinction mattered. Rebecca had never asked the expert to accuse anyone. She only wanted the jury to understand that certainty was no longer possible. When the witness stepped down, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. The prosecution's case had not collapsed because someone made an emotional speech. It had weakened because independent evidence showed that its central theory no longer fit the available facts. Rebecca slowly stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss the charges on the grounds that the state's timeline has been fundamentally undermined by newly authenticated evidence." The judge didn't rule immediately. Instead, he announced a short recess. As everyone began leaving the courtroom, reporters rushed into the hallway, sensing that the trial had reached a turning point. Emily Carter remained seated at the defense table, staring silently at the evidence screen that had displayed her movements minute by minute. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt that the truth no longer depended only on her words. It was now speaking through the evidence itself. The courtroom filled more quickly than it had on any previous day of the trial. Long before the judge entered, reporters crowded the hallways outside, hoping to be the first to report the decision. Families of hospital staff sat quietly in the gallery, while legal analysts whispered among themselves about how dramatically the case had changed over the previous week. Only a month earlier, nearly everyone believed Emily Carter would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Now, after the forgotten phone call, the deleted badge record, the hidden construction camera, and the altered medical file, certainty had given way to doubt. The question was no longer whether the evidence looked convincing. The question was whether anyone could still say with confidence that Emily Carter had committed the crime. Emily sat beside Rebecca Lawson, her hands folded tightly together. She had imagined this moment countless times during the months she spent in jail, but reality felt strangely different. She wasn't thinking about freedom. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She was thinking about the life that had disappeared the morning detectives walked into the hospital. Her nursing license had been suspended. Her reputation had been destroyed. Friends had stopped answering her calls. Her parents had watched strangers on television describe their daughter as a murderer before any jury had heard a single witness. Even if she walked out of court that day, she knew she could never return to the person she had once been. When the judge entered, the room fell completely silent. He began by summarizing the purpose of the hearing. The court was not deciding whether another individual had committed a crime. That question, he explained, would require a separate investigation if prosecutors believed additional evidence justified one. The court's responsibility was much narrower. It had to determine whether the prosecution had presented reliable evidence capable of proving Emily Carter's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge reviewed the newly discovered evidence one piece at a time. He referred to the verified hospital phone records, showing Emily answering an internal call while prosecutors claimed she was administering the fatal medication. He described the deleted security badge record recovered from the backup server and noted that its authenticity had not been successfully challenged. He acknowledged the construction camera footage, placing another hospital official inside the restricted ICU corridor during the critical period. Finally, he discussed the independent forensic examination, confirming that important portions of Michael Donovan's medical record had been edited after the patient's death. None of those findings, the judge explained, automatically proved who was responsible for the tragedy. But together, they fundamentally changed the reliability of the prosecution's timeline. He paused before speaking his next words. In every criminal trial, the burden of proof belongs to the state. It does not belong to the accused. When newly authenticated evidence demonstrates that the state's central theory can no longer be relied upon, the court cannot permit the conviction of an individual whose guilt has not been established beyond a reasonable doubt. The silence inside the courtroom became almost overwhelming. Emily looked toward Rebecca, searching her face for some indication of what was about to happen. Rebecca simply nodded once. The judge continued. Accordingly, this court grants the defense motion. The indictment against Emily Carter is dismissed. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Several reporters immediately hurried toward the exits to file breaking news alerts before the hearing had even ended. Emily remained completely still. For several seconds, she didn't react. It wasn't because she hadn't heard the words. It was because she had spent so many months preparing herself for the possibility of losing everything that her mind struggled to accept what had just happened. Rebecca gently touched her shoulder. It's over. Emily closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her face. Not because she had won, but because she finally understood that someone had believed her long enough to uncover the truth hidden beneath thousands of pages of evidence. As she walked out of the courtroom later that afternoon, dozens of cameras surrounded the courthouse steps. Microphones stretched toward her from every direction. Emily, do you have anything to say? Do you blame the investigators? Will you sue the hospital? She stopped for only a moment. Looking directly into the cameras, she answered quietly. I don't want people to remember my name because I was accused. I want them to remember how easily an innocent person can lose everything when questions stop being asked. Without another word, she walked away. Rebecca watched from the courthouse entrance. She knew Emily's legal battle had ended, but another story was only beginning. The death of Michael Donovan remained unexplained. Critical evidence had been altered. Digital records had been deleted. Witness statements had conflicted with authenticated system logs. Those questions would not disappear simply because one innocent person had finally been set free. Somewhere, someone still knew exactly what had happened inside room 312 on that rainy October morning. And sooner or later, the truth would come looking for them. Emily Carter regained her freedom, but Michael Donovan's real killer had never been identified. 6 months later, a routine audit at another hospital uncovered a pattern of altered medical records that investigators had seen once before. The same digital signature, the same method, the same name, Dr. Andrew Keller. But by then, he had already disappeared without a trace.